Hey everybody, we're going to get you the interview with golf family legend Dr. Bobby Jones IV, whose grandfather co-founded the Masters, helped design Augusta. An unbelievable interview. It's about an hour. It's incredible. I think you're going to get a ton out of it. But first, I do got to give a shout to our partners at betonline.ag. Head over there today. The online casino is always open. We have Major League Baseball in full swing. We now are on to the next phase of the sports year as we kind of start to dart into summer. Tons of stuff, whether it's parlays, teasers, pleasers, however you get down. Check them out at betonline.ag and tell them Jboy sent you. All right, David Cohn, roll that intro. Let's tee this thing off.
Welcome to the Jboy Show, hosted by Jake Crain, the fastest growing sports show in the nation.
I'm Coach Hugh Freeze.
This is Super Bowl champion Brandon Graham.
Hey, this is DJ Shockley, and you're watching.
And thanks for watching the Jboy Show.
Hello, everybody, and thank you again for joining us on an extra special week, an extra special edition, and we're going to have multiple of these of the Jboy Show. And what a better way to kick off Masters Week with the guy whose family helped co-found the Masters, helped design Augusta, and is really on the Mount Rushmore. If you look at Tiger Woods, you look at Arnold Palmer, that have really moved the needle and changed the game of golf. Dr. Bobby Jones IV. Doc, it's so exciting to have you here. What your family has done for the game, and it's that name is synonymous with golf, and it always has been. It's an honor and a pleasure, and I know you're a psychologist, which means you're 10 times smarter than me, but I really appreciate you doing that.
Jake, thanks so much. I don't know about the 10 times number. I've heard your work. I think it may be the other way around. So there you go.
Well, I appreciate that, and you're too kind. And I want to jump right in. I've been excited about this since I heard you'd be able to come on, and we've all heard the name Bobby Jones, and there's so many things that stick out, and not just the way he played the game, not just his talent and ability, but the things that he molded. You look at how the clubs are different nowadays with what they were hitting back then. But my first question to you is, what does the game of golf mean to the Jones family personally and to you personally?
Well, let me just start with me personally. The game of golf for me, of course, it's a fun time to be outdoors and hit a ball with a stick, which is always a great thing. But, of all the things that I think really set golf apart from any other game, is it's a game that actually calls for integrity. I mean, It's a self-policing game. We don't have referees in golf. In most other sports, if you commit an infraction of the rules and the officials don't see it, that's really not a big problem. But if in golf, if you commit an infraction of the rules and you don't call it on yourself, that is a big problem. And I think that's really good. The other thing that sets golf apart is that whether you are a championship player on the PGA Tour or you are just a 36 handicapper that plays at your local muni, golf is a great game of fellowship and friendship. It always has been, and to a large extent, it always will be. And the beautiful thing, especially in our society, which is divided in so many ways, you can put golfers of any demographic you want together on the golf course, and for that 4.5 hour period of time, everybody is brother and sister on the golf course. And that, I think, is a very unique thing about our sport.
Without a doubt, it really is a unifier, and especially you look around today. I mean, you got the international tour, guys coming over here to play on the tour. Guys may speak different languages, but they all speak the same language of golf, and it's who can put the ball in the hole as fast as possible and the least amount of shots. But, I want to start from the beginning, because this story, Chapter 6 and 7 don't make sense if Chapter 1 doesn't get addressed. And, back in the day before we had, ESPN and these different networks where we're always watching, and ABC and CBS, and we've got the Golf Channel and stuff like that, it was really a spectator sport. But what got Bobby Jones involved in golf? Because once he got in, it was a rocket ship.
Well, it was. He was born on St. Patrick's Day in 1902 in Atlanta, and he was very, very low birth weight, did not eat solid food till he was about 5 years old. And his parents decided, the Atlanta Athletic Club had built a new golf course in like 1904 out in East Lake. And they decided to go out there for the summer to give him the opportunity to be in the air. And about the same time, one of the greatest things that could have happened did happen, and that was the athletic club hired a new pro named Stuart Maiden to come to Eastlake. And Maiden had this very syrupy, smooth, Carnoustie-like swing, which basically is a technical term, which meant very, very upright swing, more like the modern golf swing that we see today. And Bub learned by watching Stuart Maiden, just by simply imitating him. He never in his entire life had a formal lesson from Stuart. He played in his first tournament at 6 years old. It was a small 6-hole affair between himself, Alexa Sterling, who would later become one of the great women players in history, Perry Adair, and Frank Metter. And they played 6 holes over the Eastlake course, and at the end of the tournament, Mrs. Metter, who kept the score, decided that she totaled up the card and realized that my grandfather had won a little sterling silver cup, which you will see at the Atlanta Athletic Club to this day. Now, my grandfather believed then, and believed to his dying day, that actually Alexa Sterling, who was one of his dearest friends, had actually won that cup, but that Mrs. Metter would not give it to her because she was a girl. And my grandfather, though, believed that to his dying day. And I think it's really important to show you how competitive he was. Yeah. Even though he believed that, he never gave it to Alexa either. He played in his first championship, which was the Georgia State Amateur, here in Atlanta at Brookhaven, in 1916 when he was 14 years old, and then went to his first national amateur tournament in Marion that same year, where he was finally defeated in the third round by Robert Gardner, who was a great player. But my grandfather had a terrible temper. Bub felt that there were some emotions that just couldn't be born with a golf club in your hands. Yeah. And in his first round match, he played against a man named Eben Byers, who was a former amateur champion. Bub beat him 1-up in match play. And Byers was a club thrower. Bub was a club thrower. Byers even threw a club over the fence at Marion and told his caddy he couldn't go get it.
That makes me feel better.
Oh, it's amazing. And Bub said the only reason he won the match against Byers is that Byers had run out of clubs before he did. Now, that temper really got in his way. Yeah. And for about 7 years, he just couldn't really win anything because he would throw clubs. He would, in fact, one time in 1922, he threw an iron down and it bounced off the ground and hit a woman in the shin and cut her leg open. And when he got home, he had a letter waiting for him from the United States Golf Association telling him that unless and until he could learn to control his temper, his applications to play in USGA events would not be accepted. The following year in 1923, he broke through and won the United States Open at Inwood Country Club in Long Island. And after that, he went on one of the greatest tears that has ever been seen in any sport. Between then and 1930, he won 13 national championships. He became the first man to win in history to win what's called the double, which is the Open Championships of the United States and Great Britain in the same year. And he became the only man in history to win the Grand Slam, which is all 4 championships, national championships in the same calendar year. After that, he retired from competitive golf. But in that 7-year span, he won 13 majors, 4 United States Opens, 5 United States Amateurs, 3 British Opens, and 1 British Amateur. Never finished out of the top 10 in the United States Open in his entire career except one time when he was tied for 11th. He would have had more championships, except he lost a few Opens in a playoff, and actually lost one of those and ended up in a playoff because he called a penalty on himself in 1925.
Yeah, and I want to get there because I think it's just there's so many fascinating aspects of this whole story. But do you think there's a direct correlation between getting that letter, him changing his temper, and then him soaring? Do you think if that letter was never written, if that club never hit the ground and cut that poor lady's shin, do you think he would have went on the run that he went on?
It's really hard to say, and I doubt it, because I think what that letter did, first of all, he held George Herbert Walker in tremendously high regard, so that was a really embarrassing thing for him to get the letter. But it forced him to do a couple of things. It forced him to figure out how to handle his emotions in a more productive way on the golf course. And one of the things that he decided to do was to not let anything show. He wanted nobody to be able to tell at the end of a hole had he made a birdie or had he made a double bogey. And the way that he did that was he told himself he had to monitor these muscles right here, because these very small muscles in the face are where your first emotion or your first bit of tension creeps into the swing. If it creeps in here, it's going to creep in here and down in the shoulders, and basically you're dead. So he really worked hard to keep that very, very blank kind of face. Second thing he did was he worked hard on controlling his breathing. Now, he did that in some ways that I wouldn't recommend today. Like, one of the things he did was he would smoke a lot of cigarettes on the golf course. I would never recommend taking in a carcinogen to anybody.
I think John Daly tried that.
John
as well.
Daly tried that, yes, and several still do. But yeah, so I mean, and it's very funny because a lot of the things that he did are things that in sports psychology now we just know to tell people to do.
Yeah.
But for him, it was forced on him by that letter that he had gotten from the USGA.
Well, it's amazing. You know, it's some people believe in coincidences, some people don't, but it's amazing once you're able to relax a little bit, or at least figure out, you know, kind of your mantra and your routine, your true ability comes out, and we all know how gifted he was. And, you know, you brought up calling a penalty on yourself, and you talked about in the game of golf, you being able to police yourself, and it's found out that you can't. Well, then they'll police you once they find out. But in the 1925 U.S. Open is the time I know you're referring to.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? And it's hilarious to me because Gene Saracen, and I'll let you tell the story about why the penalty was called, but Gene Saracen tried to talk him out of taking the penalty, not really for sportsmanship, but because he wanted to hurry up.
Yes, Gene was a notoriously fast golfer, and they were playing at Worcester Country Club in Massachusetts, and the 11th hole is a devilishly tricky par 4 hole, and Bub hit his second shot over the green and back into the left of the green. And it was in some rough, and he had a ticklish kind of pitch shot back to the hole, and he put his club down behind the ball, and then he looked up, and when he looked back down at the ball, it had rolled over. Now, there were people standing around. Nobody saw it roll over, and Bub called over to Gene, and he said, "Gene, my ball moved." And Gene said, "Well, Bob, I didn't see your ball move." And Bub said, "Yeah, well, but Gene, my ball moved." And Gene's kind of like, "Any of y'all see his ball move?" I said, No, ball moved. So they called over a USGA official. Now this is taking minutes. The official gets there, and he says to my grandfather, "So, Bob, what's up?" He said, "Well, my ball moved." And the USGA official looks down at the ball, and it didn't roll into a better spot. I mean, it rolled down into the grass. And the USGA official looks over at the ball, and he goes, and then my grandfather said, "Well, Bob, are you sure it didn't just oscillate a little bit?" He said, "No, it was here, and then it was here." And Gene was probably like, "Bob, I got to get to dinner here. Come on. I mean, I got to have lunch. I mean, I got to do something, anything. Let's get moving."
Yeah.
And finally, the USGA official said, "Nope, you're okay. You're the one who calls it." And he called a one-shot penalty on himself, which put him into a playoff with Willie McFarlane. And the next day they went out, and in an 18-hole playoff, he lost by one shot. If he had not said anything about that, he would be the only man in history to hold 5 U.S. Opens. But here's the thing. When he was praised about it, later on, he just looked at people and he said, "I don't understand." He said, "You may as well praise a man for not robbing a bank."
I think that just shows you the type man he was. And you know, we always look at golf, and it's, you know, the gentleman's game. You see good rapport between the players. Now, we've seen crazy things happen every once in a while, but for the most part, you know, it's very smooth sailing. There's a lot of honesty. Something else that jumps out to me about this story, and again, when you go back to this era, and it's funny because he was an amateur, considered an amateur, doing all these amazing things in golf, and he was also a lawyer. Number one, how did he manage both of those two things? And did he ever feel not slighted, or was there ever a kind of a negative connotation for him being called an amateur? Because it's funny, he became a non-amateur, or however you would call it. I'll let you explain that after he got done playing.
No, and actually back then, the amateur game was regarded every bit, if not more, than the professional game is now. For example, if you looked at a roster of players in a championship, like an open championship, you would see Walter Hagen listed as Walter Hagen. Gene Sarazen would be listed as Gene Sarazen. But amateurs like George Von Elm or my grandfather would be listed as Mr. George Von Elm, Mr. Robert T. Jones Jr. Professionals, for the most part, were forbidden to enter the clubhouse at championships. So it was actually, the amateur game was almost as important as the professional game in many, many ways. And in fact, because there was so little money in the professional game back then, that a lot of your better players just never would even dream of turning pro, because it would be a pay cut and a status cut. So they just didn't do it. Now, my grandfather didn't like that. Bub always felt that the professionals deserved a lot more respect than they were getting. And so when he founded the Masters later, and I'm sure we'll come to that, he made sure that the professionals were welcome in the clubhouse, that they were treated in every way the same as the amateurs who played in the tournaments. So, but how he balanced it, it was really interesting. He balanced it. As you mentioned, he was a lawyer. He also did a bachelor's degree in English literature, in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech, and then later did a bachelor's in English literature from Harvard. And then he came back to Emory and did a year and a half of law school and passed the bar on a dare. And so he never finished law school and just went into practice with his dad. The way he balanced it and the way he kept his golf in such good shape. He did play a lot. He thought about golf a lot, and he mentally rehearsed golf quite a bit. And he just had phenomenal natural talent in addition to that. He also had a much stronger work ethic than I think a lot of people give him credit for. The myth has always been that Bobby Jones played no more golf than your average weekend golfer. That's a lovely story, but it's totally not true. During championship season, he would probably play golf about 3 or 4 times in a week, which you could do because, you know, here in Atlanta, it doesn't get dark until well after 8 o'clock at night. And when temperatures are really hot in the summertime, well, at least back in his day before air conditioning, it wasn't uncommon for people to go to work at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, which means by 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when you're getting into the heat of the day, they'd knock off for the day and go out to the golf course. So now he didn't hit a lot of practice balls, but that was because of the limitations of the equipment at the time.
Yeah, and that's such a perfect segue because I'm sitting here. It feels like I'm looking at Wonder Boy right in front of me. But, you know, we have Calamity Jane right here. We got Jeannie Deans. And I want to find out the story behind these clubs. But you keep referring to him as Bub.
Yes.
Is that a family
Yes,
nickname,
it is.
How did that come about? Because that's such a personal connection with such a guy that did so many great things.
My cousin Bill Black, who is Bub's oldest grandchild. And Bill, when he was a boy, there were 3 Bobs alive at the same time. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father. And I think he just started calling Bub just to keep straight all these Bobs that are floating out there. And then later, after my great-grandfather died and I was born the following year, it still stuck because there were still 3 Bobs. Yeah. And in fact, one of the greatest pictures in golf, I guess, I just found this out. I didn't know that it was. There's a picture of me when I was like 3.5 years old with my father and my grandfather. And the picture appeared on the cover of the USGA Golf Journal, their magazine. And it said on there, which one of these men is Bobby Jones? And of course, the answer is all 3. Yeah. So, yeah. So at any rate, but so that's how the name Bub got started.
Okay, and that's so interesting. I know our audience, those little caveats mean able to find out because I know everybody knows who Bobby Jones is. And you know, we watch tournaments today, and you're not going to go through a commercial break without seeing some new driver that somebody came out with that the head and the shaft were mined from ore from an asteroid orbiting Neptune or whatever. And you go back and look at the clubs were used back in the day. Not only clubs, but the balls as well. You know, everybody talks about the clubs, but the balls are way different. Whether you're swinging the persimmon, you know, they just go chop a tree down and I guess shave it off and you know.
Pretty much.
The amount of clubs too, you know, the sand wedge and, you know, your 42 degree and the hybrids and stuff like that. It's amazing. But can you kind of take me through his process? How many clubs did he play with in his bag? And then I've got to ask you, where did Calamity Jane, the nickname, come from? I know the reference, but what made him want to name his putter that? And then Jeannie Deans, we talked about that a little bit before.
Yes. Well, he collected his clubs by feel. And that was very typical because it wasn't like today where, you can go get fitted or you can go to PGA Tour Superstore or some other sporting goods place and just buy a set of golf clubs. He would take every single club and he would waggle it, maybe hit a couple of balls with it. He'd be like, no, I don't want that one. And he'd put it aside. And so he assembled a set that was totally done by feel. Now, he would carry up to, at one point, I think he had like 21 clubs in his bag.
Okay, so he had a good amount in there.
The USGA has since limited that to 14, and which I'm sure caddies are very grateful for, because 21 clubs weighs, well, you can see how much this weighs. Just multiply that by 21, and you get the idea. And so that's how he would put the set together. The naming of the clubs was a whole different thing. I mean, nowadays we've got numbers that we use, or degrees of loft that we use. But back then, they had very unusual names like spoons and brassies and short spoons and mashies, mashy niblicks. So the only things we have left from that nowadays would be driver and putter and wedge. And wedge. Those are the only three that have sort of stuck around since then. But Calamity Jane, which was his putter, was something very interesting. He didn't really name it Calamity Jane, although it certainly fit. Apparently, there was someone who had a temper that rivaled my grandfather's, and also Eben Byers, which we discussed earlier, who had taken a putter and at I believe it was a Nassau Country Club in Long Island, and had basically thrown it off the golf course, and it landed in a cemetery, which was adjoining the golf course. At least this is the story. Yeah. Whether if it isn't true, Jake, it should be. And if it isn't true, we're just going to say that it is.
And we're not going to let facts get in the way of a good story. If for some reason it's not true, therefore it is true.
That is right. Anyway, the Calamity Jane the club was then picked up, brought to Jimmy Maiden, who was Stuart Maiden's brother.
Okay.
And Jimmy gave it to my grandfather and said, you need a lighter putter on these northern bent grass greens that are so fast. And so he gave it to my grandfather. And on the back of the putter was the Winton Acton Company, which is the company that made the putter, and then a stamp of their logo, which was a rose and a thistle, and then stamped on the back in punch lettering was Calamity Jane.
Wow.
And so Bub got it. This is a replica of Calamity Jane, a very modern replica made by Louisville Golf. And they can't use, well, they have it stamped on the back, Calamity Jane, but that's a replica of it. But it gives you an idea. When you're right. When you talk about the technology nowadays, I'll tell you a little story about this. His actual clubs that he used in competition are in a display rack in the trophy room at Augusta National. And I took my daughter, Melanie, to her first Masters when she was 12 years old. And we were having lunch in the trophy room, and she walked over and was looking at that rack and those golf clubs. And she was so used to seeing my clubs, which were basically made out of plutonium and titanium and other radioactive materials that were designed to give me 40 extra yards. And she's looking at these things and her mouth is just hanging open. And this is the kind of thing that she's looking at, right? And so she's looking at those clubs, and I walked up to her and I said, sweetheart, what is it? And she just can't take her eyes off these things. And she goes, Daddy, he shot all those scores and won those tournaments with those things? And I said, yeah, she did. Yeah, he did. And she just looks at me and she goes, but Daddy, those are just sticks.
That's true.
It's true. They absolutely were. They were just sticks.
Well, to me, it's fascinating because you go back and think, because the name Bobby Jones, it's synonymous with guys like Babe Ruth, Jack Dempsey, names like that are absolute titans of their sport, and you wonder if you could give Babe Ruth an aluminum bat in college, or if you could give, Bobby Jones one of these unbelievable hybrid clubs, or having the ability they're able to track it in and dial it in so uniquely, and you can hit tons of balls off the range. You're playing in all these practice rounds. I'm sure thinking back on that, it would be amazing. Now, it's a scenario we'll never get to see, but, I want to close out Bobby's playing career, because what he did even after he got done playing is just as fascinating and honestly, to the game of golf, and correct me if I'm wrong, just as important. But when he got awarded, and this to me is one of the coolest things that I've heard when me and you were talking. There's only 2 Americans, and one was grandfathered in to be awarded the Freeman of the City in Scotland,
yes,
at St. Andrews. Ben Franklin is the other one. Okay,
yes.
The guy who invented electricity, unless you watch The Waterboy and then realize Bobby Boucher's mother's the one who actually invented electricity. But can you talk about, because I know he was frustrated with that course, and then he ends up being awarded this incredible award.
When he first went to St. Andrews in 1921 to play in his first British Open, he played very well in the first 2 rounds, and the wind shifted, and in the 3rd round, he went out in 46, which was terrible. He double bogeyed the 10th hole, and he got to the 11th hole and hit his tee shot. It was relatively short par 3, and hit his tee shot into hill bunker. He took 3 shots out of hill bunker. Ball was still in the trap. He put his ball in his pocket and withdrew from the championship. He did not finish playing, though. He kept playing because he didn't want to disrupt the flow of the tournament. But he withdrew, causing one of the great golf writers of the time, Bernard Darwin, to write about him. Master Bobby Jones is just a boy, and a rather ordinary boy at that.
Wow.
When he came back in 1926, he played the Walker Cup at the Old Course and started to fall in love with it. He then went on to win the Open at Lytham and St. Anne's. 1927, he returned to the Old Course, and by this time, they had forgiven him. Because he won the Open Championship at St. Andrews at the Old Course that year. And then finally in 1930, he won the first leg of the Grand Slam, the Amateur Championship, at the Old Course as well. When he came back in 1936, he was on his way to the Berlin Olympics, and he said, I just couldn't be that close to St. Andrews and not play a round of golf. Now, I don't know if you've ever looked at a map, but the distance between Berlin and St. Andrews, it's not close.
Yeah, they're not next door neighbors.
No, they're not. And so considering you have to get there by steamship, then by train, and then you have to go back by train, and then across the channel, and then up to Scotland, it was not an easy process. So he got to Scotland to play around at St. Andrews. It was arranged by his friend Bob Woodruff, the head of Coca-Cola. And he only had arranged for R. Woodruff, R. Jones, United States. And that's what was on the starters sheet. And when Bub got to the first tee at the Old Course, there were something like 200 people waiting for him on the first tee. Wow. By the time he hit about the 8th hole, the entire city was shut down. Storekeepers put signs in their windows that said, "Bobby's back." And they were all on the golf course. He shot an inspired 34 on the way out, ended up shooting par 72 at the time. And he was so emotionally taken by the show of love that the city had for him that he never really was able to even speak about it that much. And then in 1958, when he was already in the throes of his spinal illness, he went back to be the honorary captain of the Eisenhower Cup for the World Amateur Golf Championship, the matches. And he was told that he would be awarded the freedom of the city. And he later found out that he would be the only second American, first being, as you said, Ben Franklin, to win it. And it was held in Younger Hall, which is a tiny, tiny hall. It only seats like maybe 1,500 people. They had to set up loudspeakers all over the street in front of it so people could stand out there and hear it. And he became so emotional when he got up to receive the award that even though he could barely walk without assistance, his adrenaline was so strong that he leapt to his feet and walked over almost unassisted. He had to put his hands on the table. And he made a speech in which he said two things that have become really associated with him. He said, in his speech to the people of St. Andrews, he said, "Friends are a man's greatest treasure, and a life filled with friendship is rich indeed." And then later he said, "I could take out of my life everything except my experiences here at St. Andrews, and I would still have a rich, full life." And then finally he closed his speech out by saying, "You know, what you've done for me today is just so wonderful." And he said, "I like to think of it this way." He said, "With what you've done for me today, now I can feel as much at home here officially as I have presumed to feel unofficially for years." And the place just went crazy, and he had to make his way back to his seat. And at that point, it was time to leave, and they brought a golf cart to take him and Provost Robert Leonard, who was essentially the mayor of St. Andrews, out of Younger Hall. And a voice up in the loft, a male voice up in the loft, started singing the old Scottish song, "Will Ye No Come Back Again?" And the entire place just burst into singing this as he was driven out of Younger Hall. He said it was the most moving experience in his golfing life ever. Of course, not equaling, of course, his children in marriage, but outside of that, it was the most moving experience of his life.
Well, it seems like he overtook the Hill Bunker, and it sounds like a pretty extraordinary boy at that. When 200 fans and the whole city shuts down to watch a casual.
And you know, Jake, later on, Bernard Darwin became probably the man who's called him a rather ordinary boy. Became one of his greatest fans and dearest friends.
Wow, it's amazing how that happens. I mean, half my friends, we started out by getting in fights and becoming best friends. You know how that goes.
Exactly.
But I want to talk about his retirement because it's such an interesting reason for retiring. But before I get there, I keep mentioning all these names. Jack Nicklaus, Arnold Palmer, Tiger Woods, Bobby Jones, and his relationship with Jack Nicklaus, the Golden Bear, and obviously with Arnold Palmer. But he was closer to Jack Nicklaus, correct?
Oh, absolutely. When Jack came on the scene, Jack burst onto the scene as an amateur when he was at Ohio State. And Bub went to actually watch him play in some junior tournaments. And there are photos of Bub with Jack when Jack was like 14, 15 years old. Bub was always Jack's hero. Not coincidentally, Jack is mine. So he's my hero. So it sort of fair play, I guess. Only Jack is a much better golfer than I am. But Bub had always hoped that Jack would stay amateur, and even wrote him a letter to that effect. But Jack just couldn't do that. And Bub understood that. Bub understood that the way the game had changed, that in order to get the level of competition that Jack would need, that he would have to play regularly and professionally just to get the pressure that he would need from the sport.
That makes sense. It still blows my mind how they wouldn't let professionals in the clubhouse, but would let amateurs. And now you think about that in today's game, and that's absolutely bewildering. And let's talk about his retirement.
Sure.
You have this incredible career. You become this pillar. And can you talk about the reason why he retired? Because I think this goes back to who he was and that he cared about people.
Well, there were multiple reasons why he retired, Jake. I mean, the first one was he was worn out. He had been playing top-level competitive golf since he was 14 years old. He was now 28. He had already passed the bar and decided that he wanted to be a lawyer for his profession. He already had 2 children and was married with 2 kids and needed to make a living. But also during the time around which he was thinking about retirement, or at least retirement from competition, the Depression hit. And he found out that there were people, especially people in Atlanta who didn't really have the money to do it, who were betting extraordinarily large sums of money on him to win championships. And that was a burden he just really did not want.
He didn't deserve that either.
No. There's a story, in fact, you and I talked about it, where a lot of people thought that he had bet money on himself to win the Grand Slam. And it's not true. Another Bobby did it. That was Bobby Cruikshank, who I think bet $5,000 with Lloyd's of London at 50-1 odds that Bobby Jones would win every tournament that year.
And hit it.
And yeah, talk about winning the lottery.
Wow.
So Bub at that point decided that it's not that he wanted to leave golf, because as he titled one of his books in 1960, Golf is My Game, it was going to always be a part of his life. But he really felt that his playing days had ended. There was nothing more that he could do. I mean, what do you do for an encore?
Yeah.
You retire from golf, design Augusta National Golf Club, and start the Masters tournament. That's not bad. You do a series of instructional videos for Warner Brothers that are still considered state-of-the-art to this day. That's not bad. And you raise a family and enjoy time with your family and friends, which is also not bad.
Hey everybody, we just took the turn on our way to the back nine. Gonna hit the clubhouse for a second until we get on number 10. Want to tell you about our friends over at ebay.com/sneakers. Head over there today. Whether you want old sneakers, new sneakers, they've got an unbelievable assortment, unbelievable selection, a full team of authenticators. They're gonna check the logo, the tag, the box, everything that comes with the shoe that you thought you ordered. It's what you're gonna get. So no games, no gimmicks. Head over to ebay.com/sneakers today and go ahead and get you a pair. All right, let's get back in the box. That's not bad at all. And so when did he decide? Because he helped design Augusta. You know, we look at these beautiful pictures that our production guys, or we have the best in the business, set up here. What inspired him to do that? And you look at the Masters now, and it is the tournament. It is the premier tournament. You cannot know a thing about golf but know what the Masters is. And what inspired him, like I said, to design it? I know that has there been, multiple alterations? Have they kept it? We hear Amen Corner and all this stuff. Can you just talk about what led to that? Because again, today it is the pillar of the sport.
Yeah, no question. Yes, he decided to build a golf course because he really wanted to build something that represented his thinking about how a golf course should be. He knew all the way back in the late 1920s that he would want to build a course. He wasn't sure necessarily where. He thought Augusta would be a great location because he knew that whatever he built would have to be a national course, in other words, drawing a national membership. And Augusta was on the main rail line between New York and Florida. So a lot of the wealthy business people coming out of the Northeast would stop in Augusta and spend several weeks there playing golf at Aiken Country Club, or at Palmetto Golf Club in Aiken. And they would stay at hotels like the Bonaire Vanderbilt in Augusta, which was basically the big resort of the time. So the climate at Augusta was quite good. He already knew a lot about Augusta, having played tournaments at Augusta Country Club, Aiken, also at what was the old Forest Hills Ricker course. So he also knew who he wanted to have as his architect, and that was Alistair Mackenzie, who had designed such great courses as Cypress Point and Pasatiempo out in California, also known for Royal Melbourne. He's designed the golf course at the University of Michigan. I mean, there are a lot of Mackenzie courses that are out there, and they're really fantastic. Now, in terms of the design, though, Mackenzie always said that the Augusta National Golf Club was primarily my grandfather's design. Mackenzie always said, I mainly helped with some issues on things like drainage and routing, a little bit on routing, but the golf course itself was Bobby Jones' design. And he said the point to it always was to capture the shot values and the strategy that was found on the great links courses that my grandfather had played. Now, Jake, the problem with the links with that, though, is that Augusta is about 100 and some odd miles inland, so it by definition can't be a links course. But the strategic value of Augusta National, I think, has remained to a large extent unchanged, even though, as you said in your question, the course has been modified significantly over time. And people say, well, it's been so modified it just doesn't even reflect what it was originally. And that's probably true, but remember that the very first modifications, the very first Masters was played in March of 1934. The very first modifications in the course were made in time for the second tournament in 1935.
Okay.
So I mean, it has always been tweaked, tweaked and moved here and there, like bunkers get moved around a little bit. Green complexes get changed because turf grass management has changed. And so, but the goal has always been, and especially under Chairman Fred Ridley, the goal has always been to retain the shot value, basically meaning the strategic value of the golf course has been around since its founding. But you mentioned it being the premier golf event in the sport, and that's true, but it wasn't always such. In fact, it wasn't until around 1960 that it got to the point to where they were, up until that point, they were always begging people to buy tickets. And it wasn't until around sometime in the 1960s when Arnold Palmer came along that it actually got to the point where they could close their ticket list.
Wow. But
I'll tell you how bad it got. The club closed in World War II because everything closed during World War II. And when the war ended, there was a big debate about reopening Augusta National. There's just one problem. They didn't really have the money. So Cliff Roberts talked to a few of the members, and they raised a certain amount of cash, but they knew that they were going to need a loan to get them going. So Cliff decided that Bub needed to go to New York to meet with a man named Alan Smith, who was one of the loan officers for the First National City Bank of New York. Now we call that Citibank.
Yeah.
And so,
they've done pretty well.
Yeah, they've done all right. And so Bub gets on the train, and he goes to New York, and he meets with Smith. And Smith said, well, now, Bob, here's what we can do. We can loan you X number of dollars. These are the interest rate terms we can give you. And these are the terms by the number of years you can pay it back and what we expect. These are the penalties. And there's no prepayment. And he's going through all these terms. And Bub looks at that and he says, all right, Al. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, I'm going to need to call Cliff and discuss this with him and see what he has to say. And so they said, fine. So they brought in a portable phone, which in 1946 meant a phone with like an 80-foot cord. And they get Cliff on the phone, and Bub says, well, Cliff, it's Bob. I'm up here talking to Al, and Al's given us the terms by which we can get the funding to get the club reopened. And he starts explaining the terms, and Cliff Roberts goes ballistic. He is screaming. He is, why that no good, I'm not paying that kind of. Yeah. And he's so loud that Bub has to hold the phone out from his ear because it's just blasting at him. Everybody is hearing this conversation. Mm-hmm. And finally, Cliff finally ran out of gas. And Bub said, all right, Cliff, I'll tell Al that, and we'll talk to you soon. Yeah. And he hung up the phone, and the banker looks across, and he says, well, Bob, what did Cliff say? Well, everybody knew what Cliff had said, and Bub just looked back at him, and he said, Al, Cliff said that'd be fine. Signed the documents, and there it was.
That's amazing.
And that's how they reopened.
That's such an amazing story, and it's so funny to me, to say not until 1960 they were able to close the ticket list. I mean, nowadays it's so popular, you got a better chance of getting a golden ticket to Wonka's Chocolate Factory than you do in the Masters now, and it's such an amazing experience. And I've had friends that have gone there, and it's just such an amazing event. We know the venue and the tradition and the pageantry and stuff like that. And when you watch this tournament, with the relationship, obviously that your family has with it, even with the changes that have been made, when that music comes on and you see that intro, does it take you back a little bit? Is there a moment of reflection, or is it just through the whole tournament?
No, through the whole tournament, but that always does kind of get me. The natural beauty of the place, actually the cultivated beauty of the place, because it takes a tremendous amount of work to make a course look that natural. And I'm not making that as a joke. I am dead serious. They put a lot of thought and effort into everything they do there, and it shows. But yes, it always does. But it doesn't come back to me in quite the same way that it does for most people. Most people think of like Tiger Woods' great victories there, particularly the 1997 one when he won his first Masters, or Jack in 1986. My memories are a little bit different. I think about times that I spent there with my own father, who passed away very suddenly in 1973. Or I think about times when I've met really wonderful people there, some of whom are quite famous, but some of whom are quite not. Yeah. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was walking up the 10th fairway one day, and there was this elderly gentleman by the ropes, and we'd stopped to watch a shot, and I'm standing there with my wife, Mimi, and this gentleman looks over and he sees my badge, and my badge says Bob Jones IV, and he says, "Excuse me, sir," he said, "are you related to Bobby Jones?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm his grandson." And he said, "Oh," he said, "well, it's such an honor to meet you." And he told me his name. He said, "I've been coming to the Masters for many, many years." And like a lot of those people that do that, he had every Masters ticket he had ever had on a hat, a bucket hat that he was wearing. And of course, he said, "I've been coming to this tournament for many years." And I looked up at his hat, and I said, "Yes, I can see that." And he said, "And I just want you to know," he said, "years ago, I remember I met your father and your grandfather. Your dad was driving your grandfather around in a golf cart, and I was down by number 12 with some of my friends, and they stopped and spoke with us for several minutes, and your grandfather was very interested to know who we were and where we were from and how many Masters we had attended." And he said, "Your grandfather and your dad were so kind, and they didn't have to do that." Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing that really stands out to me about Augusta National and the Masters, or at least in my memory it does. For example, nowadays, you read in the press about the green jackets at Augusta, and it's oftentimes not written in the nicest kind of terms. But yet you go to the Masters nowadays and you see somebody walking around kind of aimlessly, and they'll go up to a member and they'll ask, "How do I get to such and such?" And you'll see one of these men and women stop and say, "Oh, well, you'll just want to go right over there and maybe turn right." And if they still look confused, I've seen members who will say, "And do you want me to take you over there so you can find it?" And see, that's really what that experience is about. Jim Nantz coined the phrase, what is it, a tradition unlike any other? Yeah. And that's really true. And the traditions that are unlike any other are not just the ones that happen inside the ropes. It's the courtesy and the sportsmanship and the appreciation of the tradition that goes on outside of it that makes it tremendously special.
So it's the family feel and like you said, almost a sense of community being on those grounds. And you talk about it looking natural. And for our audience, for the people that have never been there, I know it's a no-fly zone over there. We know all the jets that are lined up on the runway going there. But the process, and you've been there and you've seen it with your eyes, the members and the security, you can't take your phones on the course, correct? Don't you have to turn your phones? So what are some things,
at least turn them off.
At least turn them off. Well, what are some things on those grounds that they do to keep it so pristine, just from a manpower standpoint? Maybe some stuff our audience doesn't know, because I find it fascinating how well they protect that place.
Well, you mentioned the security, and of course that is incredibly strong. But then again, remember, they have people in their membership who are security targets. I mean, they've got serious political leaders, corporate leaders, and then just very successful business leaders. So, I mean, there's some serious security needs there. So that's one thing. And I don't know enough about that to really speak intelligently to it. But in terms of the course, I mean, they're just little things that they do. Like a lot of courses nowadays have what are called sub-air systems under the greens that allow the greens to drain off in case it's basically a big vacuum cleaner underneath the green that keeps the green dry. They do that. They are able to do that, not just for the greens, but for the whole course. That's why sometimes if there's serious rain, you'll see the patrons walking in mud up to their knees, but the players are walking on essentially dry or at least damp ground.
That's incredible.
Because the water's being sucked off of it. Underneath the 12th green, which is in shade much of the time, they have a special system that was underneath that green that can keep it at the proper temperature so the grass doesn't die. When you have a budget like they have to maintain it, and of course nobody knows what that is, but I'm sure it's whatever it needs to be.
I'm sure they don't hurt.
No, I'm sure. And then they're able to do what it takes to keep that course in incredible shape all year. Now, if you go there and play in October, it is not going to be in the same condition that it's going to be in the first full week of April. And that's because everything they do is designed to peak in this coming week. And so you can rest assured that the golf course is right where it needs to be at any point, so that by the time you hit that first full week of April, it looks its best.
That's incredible. And as we reach the amen corner of our interview here with Dr. Bob Jones IV, and it's been amazing. I mean, I did as much research as humanly possible, and yet you have enthralled me with new things. I would have never known that they had vacuums literally underneath the greens. That's incredible. And the technology nowadays, as we spoke on before, is incredible. But you know, you're a psychologist, and again, I may be just, fishing for trout in the Atlantic Ocean here, but the game is such a psychological game. It's such a mental game. Now, you have guys nowadays that lift weights and bench press 350 pounds and play gorilla ball, like I call it. You see Bryson DeChambeau that, looks like he plays tight end in the NFL. But were you kind of inspired by the mental part of the game to get into psychology? Is there any parallel there, or was it just something that kind of happened? Because golf's the most psychological sport there is, in my opinion.
It is. Actually, no. I became interested in psychology originally, and my studies have been this way, to be what's called a clinical psychologist, to help people who struggle with mental disorder. But as I was in school, I started seeing how psychology applied to athletic performance as well. And so while I didn't make that a formal part of my training in getting my doctorate, I did do a lot of research in the area. And over the last 20 years, I have applied and done a lot of work in sports psychology with athletes from everybody from teenagers to professionals to very good amateurs to businessmen who just want to play better golf for their work. And then because of my clinical work, it's also extended to athletes who struggle with some mental health issues, because one of the things about the pressure of playing competitively is that if there are some weak areas psychologically, the pressure of competition will bring them to the fore. And so my experience as a clinician also helps as well. And then finally, it's more recently branched out too into helping people with some of the psychological aspects of injury rehabilitation. Okay. And some of that has been born by knowing my grandfather in dealing with his illness as well. Yeah. So he did influence me, but that was not why I initially became a psychologist.
Okay, I had to ask that because I found it fascinating. When I found out your profession, it seems all encompassing as well in what you do. And you guys do a ton of charity, some great charity work, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But I got to ask you, and I don't mean to get too personal here, but this is something I think our audience would like to hear. What is your fondest golfing memory? Family-wise, what is one, and I'm sure you have many, I'm sure the golf experience you have been a plenty, but what is one that sticks out to you that you look back on and one you would put up there at the top, or maybe a couple?
I can give you one right off the bat. I never had the opportunity to play golf with my grandfather. In all honesty, because of his illness, I never in my entire life saw him walk unassisted. I never experienced him hugging me because he couldn't use his arms to any meaningful way. But the one that stands out to me, I was playing a round of golf on September the 27th, I think it might have been 2002, on his 100th birthday year. And I was playing at Marion Golf Club in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, which is where he played in his first tournament and where he closed out Gene Homans to win the United States Amateur in 1930 and complete the Grand Slam. And now here I am on the very anniversary day of that event, and I'm playing Marion. And I got to the 11th tee, and it's the hole where he closed out Homans, the 11th hole. And I'm standing on the 11th tee, and there's this big boulder there with this plaque on it that says, on September the 27th, 1930, on this site, Robert Tyre Jones Jr. defeated Eugene Homans to win the U.S. Amateur and win the Grand Slam, something along those lines. And I'm looking at that, and all of a sudden it hits me like a ton of bricks. Oh, my word, here I am. Here I am, right on the spot. And I hit my tee shot, which I must brag was a very good 3-wood down the right center of the fairway. I mean, I popped that bad boy.
There you go.
And I'm watching that ball fly down the fairway over that hill. And I walked off that tee, and I just burst into tears. Wow. I've never cried on a golf course, except maybe like when I was injured. And I just burst into tears, and I was walking down the fairway. The event we were playing in was an alternate shot event, and my partner, who's a great buddy of mine named Chip Oat, Chip and I are walking down the fairway, and now Chip's got to hit the second shot into that green. And there's this little brook that runs in front of this very small green. And Chip's watching me just boo-hooing like a baby. Yeah. And as he's walking down the fairway, he's just sitting there, he starts sweating. Because it's like 50 degrees out. I mean, it's Pennsylvania, and it's late September, and it's cold. Yeah. And the reason he's sweating is because he said, oh, my gosh, if I hit this thing in the water, Bob's going to kill me. But that's one.
Yeah.
But that's one.
That's incredible.
And the only other one that I think kind of ranks up with that was when I was 12 years old, and I attended the Masters for the first time. It was also the first year that my grandfather did not attend. And I'd gotten in one night late, and it was pitch black dark, and the next morning I woke up at about 6:15, walked out on the porch of the Jones cabin, and there was Augusta National in its vista right in front of me. The clubhouse was to my right, and you could look down the hill, you could look all the way back over to 9, you could see it, the whole thing. And as I said, my grandfather was an invalid. I never really knew him as the great golfer Bobby Jones, right? And yet, all of a sudden, it hit me that everything that I was looking at had existed in my grandfather's mind before a shovel full of dirt had been turned over on that property. And all of a sudden, the immensity of who Bobby Jones was just descended on me like a ton of bricks. And I realized the total significance of who he was and what he had done in a way that I never would have discovered just reading a book.
That's unbelievably powerful. And you know, before we close out, you know, you made a comment earlier about instructional videos.
Yes.
And like I talked about earlier, this is chapter 6 for me. We've gone 1 through 5, and this is a great way to close out before we talk about the charitable work. Yeah. And again, I really appreciate being here. This is amazing stuff. So, you know, before the pandemic hit and everybody went to the movie theaters, you go down. Some people love watching the trailers, the previews, seeing what's coming, sitting down with your popcorn. But when your grandfather was on there, he was the preview before the money because there was nobody else really doing instructional videos. And you made a fascinating point that, you know, it wasn't like it was on TV and everybody could see a swing. So, I mean, that was worth its weight in gold.
Yes, it was. No question about it. When he retired from golf, one of the first things he did was he signed an agreement with Warner Brothers to make a series of 12 movies. He signed it for something like, I believe it was around $250,000 in 1930. And he was going to make a series of 12 instructional videos called How I Play Golf. Mm-hmm. And when the word got out that Bobby Jones was going to come to Hollywood and do these short 10-minute instructional videos, all the movie stars from every studio wanted to be a part of it. And in order to do it, these studios were being released by MGM and Universal so that they could go over and be filmed with Bobby Jones. And so he did these 12 10-minute clips called How I Play Golf that, you can find them easily enough now, but at the time they were state of the art. Interestingly enough, they really still are. And they were so popular that Warner Brothers came back to him and asked him to do another series of 6 videos, which he did, called How to Break 90. And so these 18 films were probably they were certainly the first real golf instruction video that was ever made. And they were the first things that allowed people to actually see Bobby Jones in action. And it's very funny because in a lot of those shots that he hits, you'll see the ball roll up like 3 feet from the hole. And in some cases, like nowadays, you'd hit a shot and some guy would just roll the ball up there. No, those were all his shots. He's hitting brassy shots from two wood shots from 245 yards out. It's at, I think, Bel Air in Los Angeles, or Riviera in Los Angeles. And he's hitting 240-yard shots 15 feet from the hole, and he's doing it every time. Wow. And people just flocked to see those. They were released back in the 1990s on video cassette. Ely Callaway of Callaway Golf was one of the ones that was kind of arranged for that to happen. Ely always said these were discovered in a vault in Kansas, which was just garbage. Yeah. What they were was Time Warner had them all along. There were only one that was bad. One was on the putter, which had been damaged just by years of use. And what Ely did was they actually did the negotiations in an airplane hangar at an airport in Kansas. But Ely thought it was better to say, they were discovered hidden in some vault in Kansas. Yeah. And then they were later released, of course, by Steve Chamberlain on DVD. Yeah. And now you can generally find them on YouTube, but there's still outstanding examples of golf instruction.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, and it's funny. We talk about him being an amateur. When he got paid to do this, was this the first time he was a quote-unquote professional golfer or non-amateur?
He was classified as a non-amateur by the USGA. Finally, in the 1950s, Joe Dye, who was the executive director, said, "Bob, don't you think you ought to reapply for your amateur status?" And Bub said, "Well, send me the application and I'll fill it out." So he filled it out, and it said, "What's your name?" It said, "Robert Tyre Jones Jr. Where do you live?" "Atlanta, Georgia." And they said, "Who's your boss?" And he said, "Clifford Roberts." And it said, "If this application is accepted, do you plan on complying with the rules of amateur status?" And Bub wrote, "Absolutely not." Signed it and sent it back to Joe Dye.
That's so funny. You can tell he's got such a good sense of humor, too, and it's such a great life story. But, we talked about the charitable stuff,
yes.
and you talked about his ailment, Bobby Jones / CSF, and I'm gonna pronounce this right, syringomyelia. Did I get close?
That is closer than any other human being has ever made.
I will take it. Dr. Rick Martinez, I can still say comminuted fracture, so shout out Dr. Rick. Wow. Maybe I'll be able to help myself by break a bone eventually, but please talk about that. It's so important.
Syringomyelia is a very rare disorder of the spinal cord, mm-hmm. where a fluid sac starts to form in the spinal cord and press on the central nervous cord. And what it does basically is it cuts that nervous cord in half, and anything that's below that cord, you lose function. My grandfather sustained an injury in 1929, and he probably had some conditions that predisposed him to it, but a syrinx formed in his neck, and so from about 1948 to the rest of his life, he gradually lost function of everything from here down. There was and is no cure. And for many, many years, we had a good partnership with the Chiari and Syringomyelia Foundation. We never wanted to lend the Jones name to it because Bub said he never wanted the disease to be known like Lou Gehrig's disease, mm-hmm. and we respected that. But finally, a few years ago, we really felt that Bub's place in the game of golf is pretty secure by now. Yeah. And we felt that since Chiari and Syringomyelia are virtually unpronounceable except by trained broadcast professionals such as you, we felt that to lend the Jones name to it would help find a cure for these conditions that together affect over 3 million people in the United States at any one time. And so we made it the Bobby Jones Chiari and Syringomyelia Foundation. You can find them on the web at bobbyjonescsf.org. Mm-hmm. And our goal is twofold. One is to help define the conditions so that medical research can be done. Two, to execute medical research that will ultimately lead to a cure for these conditions. And three, for those people now who suffer with those conditions, to give them hope and support that never used to be there. We do that in a number of ways, mainly by some direct fundraising events, but also we sponsor golf tournaments called the Bobby Jones Classic. Just this last week, we had our Bobby Jones Classic at East Lake Golf Club. You can find that. You can go on the web and just search Bobby Jones Classic, and it'll come up. And then we had a big announcement just this last week. On Monday, we finally announced October the 25th, we're going to be having a second Bobby Jones Classic at Winged Foot in Mamaroneck, New York. Wow. So that's a biggie.
Well, if there's any way I can attend, I'll get up there. I've never been to Merrimack, but I know you guys are super excited about that.
Very much so, Jake. Thank you.
And you know, we our course in this interview has ended per se. And Doc, this was unbelievable. I knew it was going to be great, but it exceeded even my expectations. And I'm an optimistic person. I can't thank you enough. We have to do this again sometime. And for
honored.
You taking your time out of your busy schedule and sharing the personal stories and the life of not only your grandfather, but you as well, and how it's affected golf. It was an honor, and may I say it was a hell of a round.
Thank you so much, Jake. Great to be with you.
Anytime. Appreciate you guys. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Unbelievable stuff. That's going to complete our trilogy with Dr. Bobby Jones IV, one of my favorite interviews we've done. Stick with us. We got more stuff coming. Go to thejboyshow.com. Get some merchandise. We're just teeing off, but this was a great one. I appreciate you again. It's been another episode. And like I've got Calamity Jane on the putt on the green, my ball's going, gone in the hole.
The Jboy Show is produced by David Cohn, Technical Director Dave Hammock, Creative Director David Culbertson, Audio Engineer Feyzan Shareef, Production Assistants Blaine Crain and Kyle Orr, Executive Producers Jake Crain, Vince Thompson, Steve Chamberlain, and David Cohn. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website, thejboyshow.com, for updates regarding our newest apparel and merch designs. Win the water cooler with The Jboy Show.